We are 2 months out from the 2024 presidential election on November 5th, and today I'll be updating my electoral map prediction by poll closing time to give you a sense of how the night will unfold. Starting at 6 p.m. Eastern Time, the polls will close in some counties in Indiana and in Kentucky, but since some precincts remain open until 7 p.m., neither state's presidential race will be called by the networks until then. Instead, at 7 o'clock, the polls will close in these two states, plus Virginia, South Carolina, and Georgia, a key battleground here, and then up in Vermont as well. Now, some areas also close here in New Hampshire and in most of Florida outside the Panhandle. Though just like the 6 o'clock states, they will also not be called until at least 8 p.m. when all the polls close. Now, as for these 6 states, at 7 p.m., we'll start in Vermont, the bluest state in the nation in 2020. It is going to be safe for Kamala Harris, while Donald Trump should comfortably hold on to Indiana, Kentucky, and South Carolina. We do have 2 more competitive races here in Virginia and Georgia. Now, the Commonwealth of Virginia voted for Biden by a 10-point margin in the 2020 election, but has looked a whole lot closer here in 2024 as you see Trump even led Biden in the final Real Clear polling average before the president dropped out of the race. Now, with Harris as the Democratic nominee, she has shifted the race back in favor of her party with a 4-point lead on average between these two most recent surveys. Still, this would be an underwhelming performance for her and the Democrats at large relative to their newfound expectations in this recently strong blue state. It is therefore only a lean Democrat state here on the map. It was likely at the start of this cycle. Down in Georgia, 16 electoral votes, one of the 7 key battlegrounds on the map, it actually went to Biden by 0.2% in 2020. That was the narrowest margin of any state in that election, and the first time that Georgia had voted for a Democrat since 1992. Biden won because of extraordinary turnout among black voters in and around the city of Atlanta. But now in 2024, we have seen Trump make gains among black and Hispanic voters as well. Also, a growing racial demographic group in Atlanta. As expected, though, Harris has clawed back at some of those losses since becoming the nominee, though either way, the polls remain extremely tight in the top line. Harris leads by just 0.1 of a percentage point here in the latest average, though since Georgia is a more fundamentally conservative state than most of the other battlegrounds that we'll get to here in a little bit, the prediction markets do have Trump as the favorite with a 62% chance of flipping Georgia as per the latest odds via Polymarket. And I do agree that Trump is slightly favored right now, as on my presidential map, it will tilt Republican. Next up, at 7:30 p.m. on election night, voting will end in Ohio, West Virginia, and North Carolina. Now, West Virginia is one of the most Republican states in the nation. It goes safe for Trump here. He won it by 40 points in the last election. Ohio, on the other hand, was the bellwether state in the nation, as the party that won Ohio won the White House in all but 3 election cycles from 1896 to 2016. It is now a strongly Republican-leaning state after Trump won it by 8 points in 2016 and again in 2020. He does lead by a similar margin in the latest polling average as well, by 9 points, based on the last 3 polls. And so back on our electoral map, it is likely Republican for Trump. Then in North Carolina, always a competitive state, but Democrats have not won a federal election in North Carolina since 2008, as Republican candidates have now won 8 straight races for president and for Senate, each by less than 6 points. Most recently here, Trump carried North Carolina in 2020 by just over a point. Now here in the polls, he leads by just under a point now in the latest average, with each of the last 4 surveys added to this average showing him leading by exactly 1 percentage point. Back on the electoral map now, North Carolina joins Georgia as a tilt state for the Trump campaign. So through 2 poll closings, Trump jumps out to an early electoral vote lead, with 81 over Kamala Harris's 16. 270 votes are needed to win the presidency. Before we jump to the 8 o'clock closing, less than 20% of you guys are currently subscribed. So please take a second and click that red button below the video. It's completely free and it does help me out tremendously. We're now going to move on to the 8 p.m. poll closing. This is the single largest poll closing of the night, worth 172 electoral votes, including the battlegrounds of New Hampshire, Pennsylvania, and Florida, as well as Nebraska's 2nd congressional district, while the rest of Nebraska remains open until 9 p.m. Precincts will also close in most of Texas here at 8 p.m., except for El Paso all the way in the western corner, which closes at 9 p.m., so no call will be made until at least then in the Lone Star State on election night. Let's begin by filling in the solid states for Harris. She will easily carry the 1st congressional district in Maine, and she'll continue to dominate down the northeast coast, here in Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, New Jersey, Delaware, Maryland, and D.C. That's Washington, D.C. Harris will also come out on top in Illinois. Each of these states voted for Biden by more than 15 points in 2020. Meanwhile, Donald Trump should easily hold the southern states of Oklahoma, Missouri, Tennessee, Mississippi, and Alabama. Now, for the more competitive races at this hour, starting in Florida, there's a good chance the Sunshine State and its 30 electoral votes will be called for Trump right as polls close at 8 p.m., given that it does report votes incredibly quickly, and Trump is expected to win Florida by a wider margin than any presidential candidate in recent memory. It was one of just 5 states where he improved his margin between 2016 and 2020, winning by 3.4%. And now the polls here in 2024 have him up by 6 points right now on average. No candidate on either side has managed to win Florida by more than 6 points since H.W. Bush in 1988. Trump might just do that in November as Florida leans Republican. Up in Pennsylvania, arguably the most important state on the map, its 19 electoral votes are the most likely to tip the election either way. Trump carried Pennsylvania by 0.7% in the 2016 election over Hillary Clinton, and then Biden flipped it back into the Democratic column by a little over a point in 2020. Prior to 2016, it had backed Democrats in 6 straight presidential cycles. Now, polling does suggest we're headed for another extremely close race. In fact, the latest average shows them tied at 47.2% each. Meanwhile, the betting markets have Trump as an ever so slight favorite with a 56% chance of winning, and I'm inclined to agree with this, as polls have notoriously underestimated Trump in the Rust Belt region in both of the previous 2 cycles, and Harris as a candidate is demonstrably weaker, electorally speaking, up here in this region compared to the Sun Belt states. She will simply struggle to match the appeal that Biden had to older white working class voters in the 2020 cycle. And that is a key demographic not only in Pennsylvania, but also in Michigan and Wisconsin, which we'll get to here in a bit. New Hampshire and Maine up here in the Northeast, on the other hand, are much more friendly to Democratic candidates. They tend to fall in line with the rest of this region, though do tend to be more competitive. New Hampshire voted for Biden by 7 points in the 2020 election, and he won Maine by a 9-point margin. Now, the polls show Biden up by an average of 5 points in New Hampshire and by an even stronger margin in Maine. It would take an extremely favorable environment for Trump to flip either of these states come November, the kind of environment we may have been headed towards before Biden dropped out, but now with Harris, they lean her way. That leaves us with the competitive 2nd districts in Maine and in Nebraska. Now, Maine 02 is ultra-rural, here encompassing the northern area of the states and one of the oldest and whitest congressional districts, demographically speaking, in the entire country. It did vote for Trump by 7 points in the 2020 election and should again back him by a pretty comfortable margin. It is likely Republican. On the other hand, Nebraska 02 is effectively the opposite. It's almost entirely urban and much more racially diverse, encompassing the city of Omaha, and it backed Biden by 6.5 points in 2020. It will lean towards Harris on the electoral map. Continuing on to the next poll closing at 8:30 p.m., the polls will close in just one state, that is Arkansas, which is a safe Republican state as it did vote for Trump by 27 points in 2020. Our next major poll closing is at 9 p.m. I call this Battleground Central Time as the polls close in Arizona, New Mexico, Texas, Colorado, Iowa, Minnesota, Wisconsin, and in Michigan, plus the Empire State, New York, and a smattering of less competitive states across the middle of the country. Together, this poll closing accounts for 162 of the 538 electoral votes up for grabs on the night. Let us first place down the safe Trump states in North and South Dakota, Wyoming, the statewide race in Nebraska, plus the 1st and 3rd congressional districts, Kansas, and Louisiana. The state of Iowa is teetering on the edge of being safe Republican. It's electorally identical to Ohio in that it voted for Obama in 2008 and 2012, but then shifted hard to the right, backing Trump by 8 to 9 points in both 2016 and in 2020. On my map, I have it as a likely Republican state, though, as we have yet to see a single Trump versus Harris poll. As for the solid blue states, Kamala Harris is certain to carry New York, 28 electoral votes. It has become a smidge more competitive in recent years, but Biden still won it by 23 points in 2020. Kamala should also have no problem carrying Colorado by a solid margin. It is the fastest left-trending state in the nation, as it backed Biden by almost 14 points in the 2020 cycle. Let's now shift our focus back to the Midwest region, here with the remaining 3 states in the Blue Wall region of Minnesota, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. Together, these 4 states voted blue in every election between 1992 all the way up to 2016, when Trump flipped Michigan and Wisconsin into the Republican column and came less than 2 points from flipping Minnesota against Hillary Clinton as well. Then in 2020, Biden flipped Michigan back by 2.8% and Wisconsin by 0.6%, while expanding the Democratic margin in Minnesota up to 7 points. Now, with that in mind, Minnesota is fundamentally the bluest of the upper Rust Belt quartet, while Wisconsin is the most Republican. The latest polling in Minnesota has Harris leading by 5.5 points on average, still an underperformance relative to Biden's 2020 margin, but enough for it to still lean blue on the electoral map. As for Wisconsin and Michigan, both must-win states for Harris in all effects and purposes. It's just hard to see a path to 270 for her without them. She does lead Trump by about 1.5 points in Wisconsin. Meanwhile, in Michigan, Harris also leads, again, by a little more than 1 point, and has led in 4 of the last 7 polls included in this average. Comparing the polls to the betting markets, Harris is narrowly favored in both states, with a 52% chance of carrying Michigan and a 56% chance in Wisconsin. Back on my electoral map, while I do have Michigan as a tilt blue state for Harris, I'm keeping Wisconsin in the pure toss-up category because after the polling misses that we saw here in 2016 and 2020, I'll probably need to see Harris leading by at least 4, maybe even 5 points to be confident in her chances once all of the votes are counted. Shifting down to the Southwest, Texas is likely to vote for Trump in November. An emerging battleground, Joe Biden did receive 46.5% of the vote in 2020. That is more than any other Democrat since Jimmy Carter last carried Texas in 1976. But with Republicans making significant gains among Hispanic voters, especially here in the Rio Grande Valley, it's hard to see Democrats improving on their 2020 margin at this point. On a related note, New Mexico is the most Hispanic state in the nation, and therefore perhaps a sleeper swing state in future cycles. For now, it remains as a likely blue state, though, after Biden's 11-point margin of victory in 2020, and the fact that we have only seen 1 poll so far, and it has Harris up by 10. Finally, wrapping up the 9 o'clock closings in Arizona, the second closest state in 2020 by margin, Biden won it by 0.3%, with 49.4% to 49.1%. Like in Georgia, he's both the first Democrat to carry Arizona since Bill Clinton, and his win is attributed to the rapid growth and diversification of its lone major city, Phoenix. Now, here in 2024, we saw Trump dominate Biden in the polls before he dropped out, and he continues to lead Harris right now by exactly 1 point in the latest average. He's led in 5 of the last 8 polls here, most falling within the margin of error, of course. Interestingly, though, looking over at the odds via Polymarket again, he has a 63% chance of winning. That's better than in Georgia and even with North Carolina. Back on my electoral map, I also have it as a tilt Trump state, adding 11 electoral votes to Trump's growing tally, as he is now just 6 votes shy of 270 with 264, ahead of Harris's 163. Now at 10 p.m., the polls close in just 3 states: Montana, Nevada, and Utah. Trump is almost certain to win in Montana and in Utah, while Nevada is our last remaining battleground. With 6 electoral votes, it doesn't hold the same electoral weight as the others, but it might be the closest race at this moment. Biden won it by 2.4% in 2020, an identical margin to Hillary Clinton in 2016, even though the nation became bluer between those elections. Republicans also managed to flip the governor's office in 2022 and received more votes for U.S. House than Democrats for the first time in decades. Now in 2024, no other state shifted harder to the right in the polls as Trump led by 5.5 points prior to the president's withdrawal, an incredible 9-point swing in less than 4 years. Again, though, with Harris now headlining the Democratic ticket, it has shifted back to Democrats as she leads by about 0.5 point in the latest average of 7 polls. That being said, on Polymarket, it's still Trump with the slight edge, as he is favored with 54% odds. As for my own rating, I still have Nevada as a pure toss-up, same deal as up in Wisconsin. Now, 1 hour later at 11 p.m. Eastern, 8 p.m. Pacific time, the polls close in Idaho, Washington, Oregon, and California. Trump is going to win the state of Idaho, while Kamala Harris will sweep the West Coast states, keeping them in the Democratic column for a 9th consecutive cycle. That includes her home state of California with the largest electoral prize on the map, 54 electoral votes. Now all that remains are the non-contiguous states of Alaska and Hawaii. Both states will see their polls close at midnight Eastern, and Alaska, unsurprisingly, is safe for former President Trump, while Hawaii is safe for Vice President Harris. And so that means that the final Electoral College projection has Trump at 281, leading Harris at 241. Now, if I had to guess which way these toss-ups go, I would probably say that Trump has an ever so slight edge in both states right now, though again, they are truly coin flips at this point. That does it for this presidential election map prediction and analysis. Let me know whether you agree or disagree with these ratings in the comments below. Big shout out to my channel members on screen here. Thank you so much for your support. If you would like to become a member, go ahead and click the join button below this video to receive exclusive perks. You can check out more content from my channel here, and as always, thank you so much for watching. I'll see you next time. EP out.